Normandy, late July 1944. The hedgerows near St. Lo steam after a night of rain. A Sherman lies at an angle in a gouged lane, its tracks clawed into the clay, turret frozen at 1 o'clock. The paint is blistered. The air should reek of petrol and burned oil. It does not. German recovery men crowd the edges of the lane, boots grinding chalk and leaf mold. An engineer officer opens the driver's hatch with a bar. No flash fire residue, no melted cords of cordite. Instead, a damp chill along the hull floor. He presses a gloved thumb against a steel bin under the turret basket. It yields a dull slosh. Cool water leaks from a torn seam and beads along a hinge line. He follows the path of the hit. A neat entry scar on the right front. Spall across the radio shelf. The crew escaped. Dark handprints on the rear deck. He waits for the sting in his nose that always comes after an American tank burns. It never arrives. Only the faint sweetness of a coolant mixture and silence. One detail is different inside this Sherman, and it will force a reckoning with everything the Germans thought they knew about tanks. The certainty took years to harden. It began in the desert, autumn 1942. The first Shermans rolled to the British at El Alamein. Wide tracks, a quick turret, a roomy turret basket. The 75mm gun throws good high explosive. Against Panzer III and early Panzer IV, it is enough. German crews note the silhouette. Tall, easy to see at range. They also notice something else. When penetrated, many Shermans burn. North Africa, Tunisia, winter into spring 1943. American units fight their first major armored battles. Sidi Bou Zid, Kasserine, Fonduc. The German long 7.5 cm KWWII-40 on the Panzer IV-G bites at range. The Tiger's 8.8 cm kills without effort. Shermans are hit in the sides and front. When a round slips past the armor, the aftermath is often the same. Flame, smoke, blackened hatches. A reputation forms on both sides. Crews give it a name that sticks because it feels true. It is pinned on the fuel. Petrol. Gasoline. The word alone seems to explain the fires. In letters, in mess tents, in German technical briefs, the line repeats, American tanks burn because they run on petrol. Inside the tank, the reality is more complicated. Early Shermans carry most of their ammunition high in the sponsons, above the tracks and along the hull sides. Dozens of rounds sit behind thin plates. A hit that spalls the inner skin sprays metal into those racks. If propellant case is split, a flame front runs fast. The ready racks inside the fighting compartment shorten the fuse. One jet of incandescent spall can turn smoke into fire in seconds. The crew procedures, while disciplined, cannot reverse physics. The German anti-tank crews aim for the flanks and the lower side plates. They are trained to follow the flash with more shots. Each round is a chance to torch what is stored in the hull. The Sherman's gasoline engine becomes the scapegoat because it is easy to name. Diesel-powered M4A2s burn too when hit in the same place, but that nuance is lost in the roar of combat. Sicily, summer 1943. Italy, autumn. Shermans grind over mountains and farm tracks. Reliability and speed earn respect. So does a powered turret that swings faster than a hand-cranked Panzer III. But the gun duel is changing. The Panzer IV with the L-48 gun and better armor forces the Sherman to close or flank. The Panther appears in numbers on the Eastern Front and in small batches in Italy. German doctrine, shaped by tests and combat reports, leans harder into first-shot kills at range. In American depots and British headquarters, teams begin to tally why tanks are lost. Numbers pile up from workshops and battlefield recovery. Photographs of penetrations are matched to locations of stowed rounds. Patterns emerge. The fires, so many of them, begin in the ammunition racks, not in the engine bays. The data trickles in, then flows. The answer does not fit the stories told at the front. By late 1943, the rumor and the reality began to part ways. The British operational research teams, working from Tunisian and Italian wrecks, logged where penetrations landed and where fires started. The U.S. Ordnance Department compared that evidence with stateside trials at Aberdeen. The pattern was stark. Tank fires traced most often to ruptured propellant cases in the sponson racks and ready racks, not to fuel tanks or carburetors. Diesel Shermans and gasoline Shermans burned at similar rates when ammunition was struck. The culprit was storage, not fuel type. Interim fixes came first. Field depots welded applique armor plates over the thin side walls that shielded the sponson racks. Ready racks in the turret were reduced. Crews were drilled to keep ammunition lids shut. These measures helped, but they did not solve the core geometry. Ammunition still sat high along the hull sides where spall and fragments could reach it. The design answer reshaped the inside of the tank. Ordnance engineers drew a new stowage plan that moved most rounds down to the hull floor, clustered in armored bins beneath and around the turret basket. Each bin sat inside a water-filled jacket with corrosion inhibitors and antifreeze mixed in. The logic was simple. Lower the ammunition, surround it with a heatsink, seal it behind thicker walls. If a hit broke a case and ignited propellant, the water sloshed in to quench the flash before it could become a persistent fire. Factories retooled through the winter. The new arrangement arrived with a recognizable external signature. Large driver AS and bow gunner AS hatches cut into a 47-degree upper glacis. On the data plates and in paperwork, the suffix appeared, W for wet stowage. For 75mm Shermans, it meant over 100 rounds packed in low bins with sealed lids. For 76mm Shermans, it meant fewer rounds, but the same principle. Around each bin, gallons of treated water waited for a breach that would hopefully never come. Production lines at Fisher Body, Pressed Steel Car, Chrysler and others fed the change into multiple variants. The M4A1-76W was the first of the new type to reach Northwest Europe in meaningful numbers. Shipments landed in Normandy in late July 1944, days after the start of Operation Cobra. M4A3-75W and M4A3-76 followed in greater strength through the late summer and autumn. Units learned the maintenance routines, check the sight glasses, top off the jackets, watch for leaks, keep lids latched. The quiet discipline of survivability took hold. Across the lines, German expectations stayed fixed. Training leaflets and unit briefings still emphasized the Sherman's supposed tendency to burn. Panther and Panzer IV crews were taught to aim for the flanks and sponsons, to cook ammunition along the sides. Pack batteries rehearsed the same. Intelligence summaries repeated the old logic. Petrol engine, fire risk. Few in Warproof 6 or the field workshops had yet seen the internal changes that now hid beneath those larger hatches. Normandy's hedgerows became the proving ground. U.S. armored divisions fought through narrow lanes, formed up behind bulldozed cuts, and broke out under a carpet of bombs on 25 July. Panthers and long 7.5mm anti-tank guns scored hits, as they always had. But something began to differ at the moment of penetration. Crews bailed out without the instant roar. Knocked-out Shermans sat blackened but unlit. Recovery teams found damp footprints on hull floors and intact ammunition bins with torn water jackets. It took only a few examinations to unsettle a certainty. The German officers who lifted those lids and felt the cool, weeping seams realized that the American tank was no longer the same enemy they had learned to kill. The contradiction between belief and wreckage could not be ignored, and the front line would force that lesson home. The contradiction between belief and wreckage could not be ignored, and the front line would force that lesson home. 25th of July, 1944. Operation Cobra. The morning begins with a wall of bombs south of St. Lo. When the dust clears, columns of American armor roll into the breaches. 2nd Armored and 3rd Armored drive on Marigny and Coutances through lanes cut in the hedges. German anti-tank guns, PaK-40s set back behind hedgerows wait in shadow. Panthers edge to firing positions and clip their engines, sighting along sunken roads. The duels are intimate, 50 meters through a gap, 100 across a pasture. Hits land hard. Penetrations punch through front plates and sponsons. Crews slam open hatches and spill out. German gunners brace for the follow-on plume, the blast of heat that has marked so many knocked-out M4s since Tunisia. It does not arrive with the same reliability. Wrecks sit smoking, but not blazing. A dark hole in the glacis. A scorched turret ring. No orange roar from the hull. By 29th of July, when American spearheads close on Coutances and German formations begin to fracture, the workshop companies that follow panzer units are already walking the lanes to mark what can be salvaged. They find an unfamiliar pattern. In multiple knocked-out Shermans, the lower hull is damp. The floor around the turret basket is slick. When they pry open ammunition bins low in the hull, the metal is cold to the touch. The seams bowed. The interiors wet. Fill ports and inspection caps line the containers. The stowage is not in the sponsons where it used to be. It sits low, behind thick walls, in jackets that hold liquid. Reports travel up the chain, clipped and matter-of-fact. American M4 variants now carry their ammunition in armored containers on the hull floor. The containers are enveloped in fluid intended to quench any ignition. Visible signs, larger hatches in the glacis, altered internal layout, fewer rounds in the turret-ready racks, lids that lock tight. Consequence, fewer immediate hull fires after a penetration. The familiar cooking when a flank was perforated is reduced. The battlefield keeps confirming it. 30-34 in July, the Rancy and Percy area fills with wrecks as German columns try to escape the breakout corridor. In the litter of abandoned equipment, more Shermans stand blackened but unburnt, their crews long gone. Recovery teams from both sides tug at them with half-tracks and tractors. American ordnance men drag many back to depots, patch holes, replace bins, send them forward again. German officers, when they get a look inside, mark the detail that matters: water jackets and low stowage. 1-7 August. The Americans cross the Sélune. Avranches holds. Fast-moving armored columns begin to stretch into Brittany and pivot east toward Le Mans. On 7th of August, the German attempt to cut them, Operation Lüttich at Mortain, throws Panthers and Panzerviehs into the hills against U.S. infantry, supported by tanks and tank destroyers. The fighting is close and violent. Shermans are knocked out in orchards and on ridgelines, yet the pattern measured in the breakout persists. Many penetrations no longer mean fire. Inside American workshops, the same tally sheets that inspired the design change begin to reflect its effects. Between August and September, ordnance officers note a marked drop in burn after penetration for tanks with the new arrangement compared to earlier dry stowage. Not an end to losses, not immunity, but a difference that crews feel in their survival and commanders see in the number of hulls recoverable for repair. For German commanders and engineers, the adjustment is sharp. In the teachings that carried them through 1942 and 1943, the Sherman's weakness could be summarized on a chalkboard. Tall silhouette, weak side armor, petrol fires. On the hedgerow front, one of those lines erases itself. Petrol is not the accelerant they thought. Ammunition, protected and cooled, is harder to ignite. The new advice from frontline officers is pragmatic. Expect fewer instant blazes. Do not assume a single flank hit will turn the interior into a furnace. If a Sherman is not burning, hit it again. As the breakout widens toward the Falaise pocket, German technical sections forward their notes to army and weapons officers. The Americans have altered survivability from the inside. Firepower and armor thickness still matter, but there is a design layer beneath those numbers, now changing the outcome of hits. That realization forces a recalculation, not at a test range in peacetime, but under the urgent arithmetic of a collapsing front. The next question is what to do with this knowledge, how to aim, how to train, How to redesign within the limits of strained factories and time that is running out. What to do with this knowledge, how to aim, how to train, how to redesign, became the next fight. The first answer came from the gunners. In hedgerow briefings and after-action notes, German crews adjusted their checklists. Do not expect the plume. Do not pause for the blaze. If a Sherman takes a hit and sits, put another round into the turret ring or the lower front plate. Sweep the coaxial sight over the bogies and take the track if the hull won't light. Disable first. Incineration is no longer a given. In workshops and technical sections, the findings were written in steadier, colder language. Field evaluations described M4 hulls with ammunition stowed in armored bins on the floor. The bins carried inspection caps and filler plugs. The seams wept a treated fluid that left a sweet odor. Internal splash baffles deflected fragments. Ready racks were fewer and better enclosed. Penetrations that once sparked violent internal combustion now more often left scorch marks without sustained flame. The contradiction with established doctrine was explicit. For years the mental model was clean. Armor, gun, engine. Shell meets plate. Plate fails. Petrol feeds fire. The new observation inverted the sequence. Penetration still killed. But fires were no longer the default. A tank might be knocked out without becoming a pyre. The enemy had redesigned the space that mattered most, the space around the crew. The tactical ripple was immediate and costly. At the platoon level, German anti-tank teams now had to budget time and ammunition for repeat shots. In narrow lanes and at short ranges, that meant exposing themselves longer in firing positions that air and artillery could find. A second or third round could be the difference between a clean withdrawal and a gun lost under a tree burst. The math had changed at the point of contact. At the operational schools, the recognition was more philosophical. Survivability could be engineered from the inside out. Reducing the ease with which a hit became a burn mattered as much as thickening the front plate. In German design bureaus, the lesson landed at the wrong moment. Panther and Panzer IV production was under strain. Factories were moving. Raw materials were short. The idea of recasting ammunition stowage into sealed, low, liquid-sheathed bins was studied, but not implemented. Changes that could be made, deleting exposed turret side racks, improving internal baffles, relocating some rounds, were incremental. There was no German wet equivalent. The confusion at the front deepened in August because not every Sherman was the new type. Mixed formations crossed the fields. Older, dry stowage tanks alongside the W variants with larger hatches and redesigned interiors. Some wrecks still burned fiercely after a side hit. Others did not. German intelligence bulletins acknowledged two patterns and tried to tie them to external cues. The safest conclusion, repeated in unit notes, was simple. Assume nothing. Keep firing until the enemy is silenced or motionless. Close-range fights reinforced the new habits. At Mortain, at banked lanes near Domfront, in the villages west of Falaise, Panther gunners worked the mantle edge and the turret ring to jam traverse. Pack 40 crews chained hits, first to cripple a track, then to break the glacis. Panzerfaust teams, moving up under cover, were told to place their shots low and follow with another. If the fire didn't come, the bailout often did. Either result still cleared the field. For the Americans, the internal change was already reshaping behavior. Crews in new production Shermans felt the difference. The first seconds after a hit, a time once haunted by a flash, stretched into the possibility of action. Hatches opened, men ran. Recovery squads moved closer behind assaults, confident that a dark hull was not a trap of residual flame. In depots, mechanics opened bins filled with blackened water and replaced lids and seals. The same tank could be back forward in days. The German reports kept their restraint, but a line crept in between the numbers. The enemy had chosen to protect the crew with design. That choice increased the number of fights a crew could survive. More crews surviving meant more experienced crews returning to the line. More recovered hulls meant more guns back on the road. A small internal detail had widened into a strategic lever. None of this reversed the physics of penetration. The 7.5 cm and 8.8 cm still killed. Panthers still burned Shermans at range when terrain allowed. But the expectation that a single good hit would also erase the crew and the hull in fire no longer held. A belief had been replaced by a measurement, and measurements in war change plans. What those measurements showed, and how quickly they accumulated, would explain why the next months felt different to the men inside the tanks and to the officers calculating losses. The proof came back to the depots in grease-stained notebooks. Behind the hedgerows and orchard walls, U.S. ordnance teams counted scars and fires, bin lids and bailouts. British operational research in 21st Army Group did the same. Their tallies from late summer and autumn 1944 aligned. Dry stowage Shermans, those with ammunition high in the sponsons, burned after penetration far more often, typically in the range of 60 to 80%. The new wet stowage tanks, ammunition low in armored bins surrounded by fluid, dropped that figure to roughly 10 to 15%. Separate channels, same answer. The change translated directly into lives. Crew survival across penetrations improved. Bailouts became common where they had once been rare. The worst flash fires that had chased men through hatches, those violent, instant blasts fed by ruptured propellant, were now frequently smothered inside the boxes that held the rounds. American ETO ordnance summaries in late 1944 and early 1945 noted not only fewer burned-out hulls, but fewer casualties per knocked-out tank. There was no magic plate and no promise of immunity. There was a better margin inside the first seconds. It changed routines. Maintenance sergeants added new lines to the morning check. Inspect the sight glasses on the stowage jackets, top up the inhibited water, look for weeping seams around hinges, lock every lid. Crew briefings tightened. Keep the bins filled correctly. Do not overload the turret with loose rounds. Keep ready racks shut. Recovery squads moved faster in behind attacks. A hull that was not burning could be hooked and dragged within minutes. The fewer the flames, the more salvageable the machine. The operational effect was subtle but real. A division that lost a dozen tanks in a day could expect to recover and repair a majority of them if the hulls had not burned. Wrecker crews and ordnance battalions working in the U.S. 1st and 3rd Army zones reported steady returns to service. Patch the plate, replace the bins and plumbing, swap a final drive, and send the tank back forward. Some units noted that wet hulls came back more often and sooner. It was not a single dramatic statistic. It was a drift in the ledger that added up over weeks of fighting. The perception shifted, too. Reports from both the U.S. and British sides emphasized that engine fuel was not the driver of the fire risk. Diesel-powered M4A2s with dry stowage had burned at rates similar to gasoline-powered M4A1s and M4A3s before the change. After the redesign, both gasoline and diesel Shermans with wet stowage showed the same lower burn rate. The myth of petrol as the prime culprit gave way to the geometry of where the ammunition sat and how it was sealed. Inside the vehicle, crews felt it in their bones. The moment after a hit stretched into something other than panic. If the tank still moved, a driver might back into cover. If it stopped, hatches flew and men got out alive. Commanders learned to trust that a dark, silent hull was often safe enough for a quick climb back in to grab maps, radios, or a machine gun. The little decisions that defined a battalion's tempo: press the attack, wait for recovery, risk a tow, bent towards speed. On paper and in memory, the conclusion matched the smell inside those bins. Survivability had been engineered. Numbers gave it weight. And as the Allies turned west to Brittany and east toward the Seine, the Germans were forced to consider what response they could manage under a sky that no longer gave them time. Under that sky, they tried to adapt. German armored units were still fighting, still hitting hard when terrain allowed. But the toolkit for a rapid countermeasure to the Sherman ES internal redesign simply did not exist in quantity. Production was stretched. Factories at Nibelungenwerk, MAN, Daimler-Benz, and MEAG were dispersing under bombing. The Panther OSF. G was already absorbing changes, glacis revisions, a new mantlet profile to reduce the shot trap, simplified hull sides. Yet none of these addressed the central problem revealed in Normandy: ammunition vulnerability and fire propagation inside the fighting compartment. There were adjustments, but they were incremental. Training directives reduced the number of loose rounds kept in turret-ready positions. Some units fitted sturdier lids and baffles over interior racks. Company armorers drilled crews to keep racks closed and to avoid overloading vulnerable bins. The Panzertruppen were not blind to the physics. They were bound by time and tooling. A comprehensive shift to armored, sealed, liquid-jacketed stowage, what the Americans now had, was not fielded in German tanks before the war ended. The consequences appeared in the salvage yard arithmetic. In U.S. 1st and 3rd Army zones, ordnance battalions reported that many wet Shermans struck by armor-piercing rounds could be recovered, repaired, and returned to service. German units facing the same rates of penetration had fewer saves. Fires, demolition charges, and air attacks consumed damaged Panthers and Panzer IVs on roadsides that recovery teams could not reach under Allied air cover. The attrition curve bent differently. American hulls survived more often as machines. German hulls died more frequently as fire and abandonment took hold. This did not make the Sherman invulnerable. In open ground, at 800–200 meters, Panthers still killed M4s with ease when they found the shot. In the Ardennes, long-barreled 7.5 cm guns again tore through American armor. But the operational rhythm, the speed at which a division could regenerate combat power, was now clearly different. Reduce the burn rate, and you reduce the number of total write-offs. Reduce write-offs, and you multiply how often a unit fights with familiar crews in familiar vehicles. Intelligence summaries, both Allied and German, reflected the same revisions. U.S. reports in late 1944 and early 1945 noted that burn after penetration in wet Shermans was a fraction of earlier figures. British OR teams in 21st Army Group confirmed it. German field evaluations circulated the observation that M4s with larger glacis hatches, often a visual cue for the new stowage, burned less frequently than earlier examples. The implication was unavoidable. The petrol myth had misled both sides about cause and cure. By winter, Allied production reinforced the internal change with external evolutions. More M4A3 76 beam tanks arrived. HVSS suspensions smoothed ride and spread weight. The heavily armored M4A3E2 Jumbo absorbed punishment at the front. None of these erased vulnerabilities to high-velocity guns, but in combination with the redesigned interior, they kept more tanks, and crews in the fight long enough for mass and maneuver to tell. For German engineers, the insight arrived in reports that did not offer a path to implementation. Protecting ammunition, its location, its enclosure, its thermal environment, had turned out to be a decisive lever in survivability. With factories dislocated and supply chains thinned, they could not pull it at scale. The Wehrmacht's late-war reality locked innovation into the margins. When the shooting stopped, the ledgers captured what the crews already knew. Burned-out hulks meant lost machines and often lost men. Damp floors and sealed bins meant recoveries, repairs, and the return of veterans to their turrets. A small internal detail had shifted the balance between destruction and endurance. What that detail taught, about design priorities, about what keeps a tank fighting beyond the first hard hit, would outlive the war and shape how nations built armored vehicles for decades to come. It outlived the war precisely because it was small. Not a new gun, not a thicker plate, but a change in where a crew kept the most dangerous thing inside their tank, and how it was made to behave when struck. The noise of 1944 was artillery, engines, bombs. The quiet revolution was a damp seam along a bin that turned flame into steam. Operational research and ordnance arithmetic took hold where rumor had ruled. Belief yielded to measurement. Designers absorbed three truths that would echo through post-war hulls. First, location matters. Place ammunition low and away from likely lines of spall, and a penetration is less likely to turn fatal. Second, isolation matters. Enclose propellant behind lids and armored walls, and you slow the chain from spark to fire. Third, recovery matters. A tank that does not burn can be repaired. A crew that survives can fight again. In later decades, different nations pursued the same principles with their own methods. Stronger internal bins, better anti-splash liners, and eventually dedicated compartments and venting that direct blast away from the crew. The underlying lesson was the one worked out in Normandy. Survivability is a system, not a single number on a specification sheet. For the men who lived it, the change was counted in seconds. The second after a hit that was not a flash. The seconds it took to open a hatch and spill into wet grass. The hours it took a wrecker crew to drag back a silent hull that would not have existed if it had burned. Those seconds accumulated into experience, and experience into units that kept their character under strain. The ledgers recorded percentages. The veterans remembered what it meant to step down from a tank that should have been a pyre. German engineers and officers, precise and unsentimental, recognized the shift even as events outran them. It was not a fix they could field at scale. It was a compass that pointed to where the real gains in endurance lay, inside, around the people, in the details that keep fire from becoming fate. In a hedgerow lane near St. Lo, a gloved thumb pressed a lid and felt the slosh. One detail, quietly engineered, had overturned a certainty and altered how armies would think about tanks.